So, okay, the original expectation of this battle was that it wasn't going to last very long because people were going to capitulate. You all know that word, right? Capitulate, surrender, give up. People were going to acknowledge that they were in over their heads, these little state militias. Even when they formed into a confederacy, even when they started to join together into a central government themselves, the Union didn't really believe that they had the power to actually stand up to them. So the fact that it stretched out over 4 years instead of just ending like in a few months was a big surprise to everybody. Another thing that surprised a lot of people is how far it stretched. And actually, even today, people who study the Civil War forget how far it ranged because most of the battles take place in Virginia. You know, the big battles that you hear about, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Fredericksburg, those all happen in Virginia. And maybe, you know, you have a special interest in watching the Civil War movies and you've seen Gone with the Wind, that all happens in Georgia. These are all things that happen east of the Mississippi River, but actually there were battles all over the parts of the United States that were west of the Mississippi too, in all of those Confederate states. So there were all kinds of reasons why there was fighting going on west of the Mississippi, but as a result of that, the war actually stretched out much further and took up more lives than people expected it to. One of the reasons for that was this. One of the reasons had to do with the Trail of Tears, oddly enough. You have to go back far enough to remember that there were pockets of Native Americans who supported moving out to their own territory and pockets who didn't. So especially in among like the Cherokee Nation was split right down the middle as far as whether they should support Andrew Jackson's moving them out to the Oklahoma Territory or they should fight as hard as they could. As a matter of fact, some of that actually happened within the same family. So I don't know if y'all remember talking about the Trail of Tears. We had David was up here and he was talking about John Ross and Stan Wadey. These are two people that are related by marriage. And one of them believed that they should sign a treaty as quickly as possible and move as far west as they could. And the other one believed, and that was Stan Wadey, and the other one believed that they should stand and fight for as long as possible. And that was John Ross. When it came time for to recruit soldiers for the Confederate or the Union Army, they came to the Native Americans and actually recruited soldiers because of some of this fighting that's happening across the Mississippi is actually happening right inside this Indian territory. So both the Union and the Confederacy recruited from among the Native Americans to fight with them, to fight on their side. Any particular reason why Native American Cherokee would want to fight on the side of the Confederacy? Can anybody name a reason right off the top? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Arguably, the Union were the ones that had driven them out of their homelands, except that Andrew Jackson was actually the president, and he was a Tennessean Virginian, so he's kind of Southerner. The biggest reason why certain Cherokee families would want to fight on the side of the Confederacy, well, what is the big reason that everybody thinks the Civil War is about? That's right. There were Cherokee families that had slaves. There were Cherokee plantation owners that actually had slaves that took their slaves with them into the Indian Territory and set up plantations in Oklahoma that still had slaves. So one of the reasons why Cherokee forces joined the Confederacy was to protect their right to own slaves. One of the reasons that they joined the Confederacy was because they perceived that the Union, the federal government, had broken their promises to them, and that if they fought on the side of the Confederacy and got independent of the Union, they might be able to negotiate new treaties. Stan Wadey believed that was the case and joined the fight on the side of the Confederacy. John Ross believed that the Union wasn't going to be, or that the Union wasn't going to be any better at, that the Confederacy wasn't going to be any better at keeping their promises than the Union was, and decided to fight instead for the side that he thought was going to win. So these two forces that are basically related through marriage to each other actually end up facing off in Fayetteville, Arkansas, under Brigadier General Albert Pike. Does that name mean anything to any of y'all? Y'all ever heard of Albert Pike? There's a big campground here a little while ago. It got flooded and a bunch of local people died. Anyway, it's named after Albert Pike. But Brigadier General Albert Pike led a coalition of forces made up of Choctaw, Cherokee against the Union at Pea Ridge, Arkansas, with the understanding that he could maintain control of this whole area by doing it. If he could do that, he could maintain control of the west of the Mississippi by doing it. Unfortunately, because of the help of John Ross's forces on the other side, they lost. And it was a Union victory instead of a Confederate victory. So, like, one of the reasons that you see fighting stretched out across the Mississippi is because there are forces that are picking sides that are so far outside of those secessionist states. But probably the biggest place west of the Mississippi where we see a lot of fighting is Texas. And this is the Anaconda Plan that they had, the Union had, which was to surround the secessionist states and cut off their supplies. And Texas was outside of that. Okay, Texas is outside of the Anaconda. It's outside of the, so Texas was valuable because supplies could still make it into Texas. They could still make it to the ports. And so a lot of the fighting in Texas happens on the ports. But actually, support for joining the Confederacy was really widespread. Now, Sam Houston was the governor of Texas in 1861, and he vetoed it. He said, we are not leaving the United States. We fought so hard to be annexed into the United States. He fought the Battle of San Jacinto specifically to get Texas to be independent so that Texas could join the United States of America. And now, like less than 10 years later, we're just going to turn around and leave. We can't do that. And so he was basically fired for being anti-secessionist. And the powers that took over as a result of that voted overwhelmingly to secede. And before anybody gets any confusion about this, the biggest reason that Texas voted to secede was slavery. It actually says in their declaration, just like the Declaration of Independence, you know, where it says right up there, this is the reason we're doing this. We hold as undeniable truths that the governments of the various states and of the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity. Hi. Just a minute. That the Confederacy itself were established exclusively by the white race for themselves and their posterity, that the African race had no agency in their establishment, and that they were rightfully held and regarded as an inferior and dependent race, and in that condition could their existence in this country be rendered beneficial or tolerable. So if anybody has any confusion about why Texas chose to be part of the Confederacy, look at their declaration. This is why they chose it, okay? They chose it because racism, okay? There's no question. And because they believed this so firmly in their hearts, they felt that they had three choices. They felt that they had joined the Union with the understanding they'd be able to maintain slavery, and now the Union was trying to limit the amount of expansion of slavery there was going to be, so broken promises. They had joined the Union with the understanding that they'd be able to keep slavery in their state, even though there were other states that were going to be added that were free soil. So they had a choice of either joining the North, which would eventually abolish their slavery, joining the South, or just going back to being an independent country again. And they did not feel that their chances surviving as a republic with the Confederacy on one side and Mexico on the other side were very strong, so they joined the Confederacy. Their reasons for leaving were definitely because they wanted to keep slavery. Their reasons for joining the Confederacy were because they thought that was the best of three bad options. So just before you get into this, okay, just to show how strong the military support in Texas was for the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee was stationed on the frontier in Texas when South Carolina seceded. So in December of 1860, when Abraham Lincoln was elected and South Carolina seceded, he was actually serving in Texas, and he was recalled to Washington, D.C. The man he left in charge in Texas was a man named Twigg, T-W-I-G-G, Twigg. And and he was in charge of all of the forts on the frontier. And when the government of Texas came to him as a Union officer and said, just so you know, we're definitely seceding and we're going to need you to let us take over your armory, otherwise we're going to have to attack you and take your guns. He literally handed 10,000 soldiers to the Confederate forces in Texas. He surrendered all 10,000 of his men, gave up his commission, and joined the Confederacy. So just so you know, when we're talking about Texas, as a matter of fact, here's a picture.
So you mean half of Facebook is wrong?
I don't know what half of Facebook you're talking about. Here's a picture of the way that pro-union people were treated in Texas. Okay, there was a group of people that had established a community. They were mostly from Germany. They had moved over as a community that believed that they could establish, you know, kind of a little outpost, a stronghold of pro-union for when the union won, that they would still be there. And somebody found out about them and pulled them out and punished them. What do you see in this picture?
You see a black man punishing one of them.
That's correct. You see a black man whipping a white unionist who is hanging by his arms from a tree. Just so you know, sentiment in Texas was very, very clear, overwhelmingly secessionist. So 70,000 Texans volunteered to fight for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and in every major battle after Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter, which took place all the way on the coast of South Carolina in Charleston Harbor, was the only battle in which there were not Texans fighting. Okay, so Fredericksburg, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Antietam, Appomattox, all of those battles had Texas regiments in them. Okay, people who ran to where the fighting was. And if you ever take my cultural history of Texas class, we talk about why Texans run to where the fighting is. It's a Texan thing. It's still a Texas thing. And there were lots of incidents in which black slaves would actually follow their masters into battle and assist behind the scenes of Confederate battles. So the relationship was very, very strong. Now, to be clear, there weren't a lot of big plantations in Texas. So most of the slave owners in Texas owned a small number of slaves who were then also very close to their families. I'm not to say that they were treated better exactly, but we're not talking about a great big pool of nameless, faceless people that belonged to one plantation. We're talking about families that had 3 or 4 slaves, and that those slaves had grown up with them, and their children had grown up with their children. So it's a different relationship, but it's still obviously a slave relationship. Probably the biggest source of mischief by Texans in the Civil War was done by the Texas Rangers. And we have at our university a great resource for this. If you ever want to know about Texans fighting, Our Trust is in the God of Battles is a book that was written by Dr. Thomas Cottrell, who is the husband of our president, Emily Cottrell, president of the college. So his book is probably in the library, but he details how Terry's Texas Rangers fought for the Confederacy. And Texas Rangers were a special breed of people. They went looking for fights. That's what they did. They had been brought in specifically to protect the first land grant holders against natives, against Mexicans, against everybody. And they basically just, you didn't want Texas Rangers to get bored because they liked to go where the fighting was. And they had fought in the Mexican-American War. They had fought in the Texas War for Independence, and they were just as happy to go and fight for the Confederacy. Probably the biggest Confederate victory that mattered in Texas was at Galveston Harbor, because Union forces tried to blockade Galveston Harbor and failed. And I want to tell the story of that as quickly as possible because I just think it's funny. Basically, there were cannons parked in Galveston Harbor, and there were Union ships and at least one Confederate vessel parked in Galveston Harbor. And a thing happened where, after exchanging fire several times over several battles, the 2 Union ships that were in the harbor realized that they were going to have to retreat. And the easiest way to do that was to load all of their troops onto one ship and blow up the other one so that it didn't get taken. It was damaged beyond repair, and they were going to have to leave it. They didn't want it to fall into Confederate hands. So they loaded everybody onto the other ship and then blew up one of their 2 ships. From the shore, the Union forces that had taken Galveston Harbor and were in control of these cannons and were actually controlling Galveston Harbor at the time, looked out into the harbor and saw one of the Union ships blown up and sinking and thought, oh, we've lost, and surrendered. So that's how the Confederacy took Galveston Harbor. Okay, so I just wanted to tell you that story. So we have fighting going on across the Mississippi. We have fighting going on in Texas. We have fighting actually stretching out. There's even evidence of face-offs all the way in California at this point. So this is not a battle that is going to stay local. It is not a battle that is going to be put down by the Union forces marching in and liberating the South from this is not what's happened anymore. So as about 1863 climbs on and 1864 finally creeps up, both sides realized that they really have to change their goals. After the Battle of Gettysburg, where the entire Army of Virginia met the entire Army of the Potomac and faced off, that was a decisive Union victory. And on the same day, the Union actually took Vicksburg too. So on the same day, July 4th, 1863, I think, yeah, 1863, the Union had two smackdown decisive victories against Lee's divided forces, Lee's forces in Gettysburg and Lee's forces in Vicksburg, the same day. As a result of that, Lee had to retreat for the first time. When he retreated, Grant did something that McClellan was never very good at. Grant didn't let him go. Grant chased him. Grant pressed his advantage. He gathered forces from everywhere that he could, and he met him in battle after battle after battle as he attempted to retreat. And in every battle, Grant took massive losses, but in every battle, so did Lee. And he had to retreat again after every battle. Okay, so this was Grant's strategy, was to hit over and over and over again. And you can kind of see it on the map, the way that it happens, the way that they sweep in and have battle after battle. And after every single one of those battles, Lee has to retreat. So up until that point, Lee had never had to retreat. From that point on, he never didn't have to. Okay, so that was Grant's strategy, was to just put pressure on Lee until he was so far into the South that there was no way that he could launch another attack against the North. There was no way that he could cross into Washington, D.C. Now, to Lee's men, that was what they had said they were going to do from the start, was be defensive. But now they're defensive and on the run. But that's not really what crashed the Confederate forces. It was hard on the morale, and it caused massive desertions, and people began to ask the question of, is there any way we can actually win this? We're just really not sure. But there were still like I said, this is not where all the fighting is going on. There's all kinds of fighting going on over here too. And in those places, a lot of those are Confederate victories that are happening on the other side of the Mississippi. But the question people are starting to ask is, what is our end goal here? What is it that we're going to actually accomplish? And that's when Sherman came in. Now, Sherman was like he was from the same immigration stock as the Texas Rangers. He was from the same go and find the fight people. He was what we call a borderlanderer. And I don't want to cover that too much right here, but a borderlander, these are people that immigrated from borders where they were fighting in Scotland, and from borders where they were fighting in Ireland, to the borders where they were fighting in Appalachia, to the borders where they were fighting in Texas. These are people who pass fighting on the borders down in their gene pool, basically. And Sherman was a part of that. He was from Tennessee, and he was a part of that sort of lineage. We'll get to that in a minute, actually. He made a prediction at the very beginning of the war that this was going to be a long, drawn-out, painful, blood-letting process, and he was encouraged to retire on the basis of insanity. Okay, in 1864, he was reinstated. He was asked to come back because he had predicted what was going to happen in the war better than a lot of people. Grant actually asked him back, but Grant was one of the people that thought he might have a point, and McClellan, who encouraged him to retire, had been fired. So under the new leadership, Sherman was asked to come back. He came to Lincoln and said, the issue with the Confederacy is that they are supported by their civilians. And that's true of every war. In every war, you've got soldiers on the front line, and for every soldier on the front line, there are 20 people in the support positions and about 50 people in the civilian population supporting that one soldier. That's true of every war. So in a lot of wars, the reason that soldiers continue to fight is because they receive support from their civilians. They receive food, supplies, thoughts and prayers, morale, parades. respect. They receive those things from their civilians. They are asked to think about the women and children back home who need them to be victorious today, who need them to do this. So Sherman believed and put this idea to Lincoln that the Confederacy needed to be shown that their civilian population was not going to escape from Union advancement. That if you cut off the civilian support, the Confederate support would disintegrate. So he proposed a campaign where he would march from Atlanta to Savannah. Okay, so here's Atlanta and here's Savannah. It's just a march. It's about 280 miles. And he was just going to move 10 miles a day, cut a 30-mile wide corridor through Georgia from Atlanta to Savannah. He started by burning Atlanta to the ground. And he warned everybody as he did so to get out, that was what he was going to do. He warned people. He sent foragers ahead, and those foragers' first job was to tell people, Sherman is coming, get whatever you need and get out. Abandon your homes, take your children, get out of the way, Sherman is coming. They were told that in advance. Then the foragers went through and took everything that they could. They took food, they took grain, they took livestock. They actually came out of towns riding on cows because they were driving livestock and pigs ahead of them. And then they met the advance wagons of Sherman's army. They loaded them up with supplies, and then they set fire to the town they had just foraged. And they did that for 280 miles, okay? The fact that Sherman was coming caused all kinds of turmoil within the Confederate ranks. Because suddenly, as a Confederate soldier, you had to ask yourself, okay, let's say I survive this battle that Lee is now asking me to fight against Grant again, even though we just did this a week ago, slightly further north. We managed to flee slightly south, and now Grant's going to hit us again. Let's say I survive that battle. Will I even have a home to go back to? And at that point, desertions among the Confederate forces skyrocketed. Confederate forces deserted the military at a ridiculous amount. He also did one more thing, and I don't know if I have this. Yeah. Because he took all of the supplies. Now, he didn't set the whole South on fire. It's important to remember that. It wasn't ever his intention to set the entire South on fire. He carved a very specific path from Atlanta to Savannah to demonstrate what the Union was willing to do in order to end this conflict. That was the whole point of that. But for all of the towns along that path, that was destruction that they still to this day, there are towns that haven't ever been rebuilt since Sherman passing through. The Georgia was a source of a lot of the supplies for the Confederate forces further north. They were one of the places that still had active plantations that were still growing food, that were still growing things. And as a result, a lot of the food supply for the Confederate military was cut off. But the biggest thing that they destroyed was control over the slave population. The fact that Sherman, I mean, if you've got a family and you've got 100 slaves on your plantation and you've got your own, yourself, your children, probably your siblings' family who have all taken shelter in your plantation, and you've got to flee, who are you going to leave behind? Who are you going to make absolutely sure makes it to safety? Probably not your slaves. You're probably not going to go to a lot of trouble to make sure that they're safe. You're probably just going to abandon them. And so slaves found themselves abandoned, and then just news that Sherman was coming emboldened slaves to run away. So the fact that they were coming. And where did they run to? Anybody want to guess? They ran to Sherman. That's right. They ran to Sherman and said, whatever you need, we'll do. Just take us with you. Don't make us go back. And so a lot of the foraging then became, and destruction actually became acts that were performed by former slaves who were moving with Sherman's army, which is good. He gave a special order 15, that promised that any refugee slaves that came to Sherman would be awarded 40 acres and a mule of captured land. Okay, now this has been misconstrued over history that Sherman made an order that all slaves would be given 40 acres and a mule. He was specifically talking to the ones in his camp at the time. He was saying, you can't keep traveling with us, you're eating too much food, but I'm gonna give you, I'm gonna make this order so you can go and claim 40 acres and take one of these mules with you and go away from the camp and go claim your land. That way you won't be following us so closely, because they were using up a lot of resources. But that 40 acres and a mule became a promise that the federal government made to freed slaves as a whole population, and then had to be rescinded, which caused a lot of, during the period after the Civil War, which caused a lot of animosity, because they were like, no, the federal government promised us that if we ran away, that if we left, we'd get 40 acres and a mule. Where'd that go? It was actually made specifically to the men in Sherman's camp. So Grant, meanwhile, following Sherman's lead on this, managed to finally face off against Lee in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy. Okay, Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and Grant set fire to Richmond. Okay, so they fought a big battle, and then he set fire to Richmond. At this point, Lee feels that he has no choice but to surrender. He puts up a good fight at Appomattox. Oh, that's spelled wrong. No, it's spelled right on your screen. It's spelled wrong on theirs. It's weird. How did y'all lose a T? Anyway, okay. That's funny. I'm going to fix it because it's going to bother me. Hold on. I'm just going to fix it real quick.
How are they not
There.
on the same screen as us?
I don't know, but we're going to fix it. There, now it's fixed. Okay, so they put up a fight at Appomattox. They lost, massive desertions, loss of morale, weapons, overwhelmingly superior weapons on the side of the South. So Lee feels that he has no choice but to surrender. I want y'all to take a look at this painting. Tell me what you see. What are the things that you notice? Anna, what do you notice about this painting?
One of them's looking like.
It looked like they coming to an agreement.
Say again?
I said it looked like they coming to an agreement. They shaking hands and about to come to an agreement on something.
Right, right. Okay, so the one in the dark coat is Grant.
Oh, is that?
This is Grant, and this is Lee. Okay, so the dark blue is Grant and the light blue is Lee. So what do you think about this? How does Lee look in this moment that he is surrendering to Grant? How does Lee look?
He's proud.
He looks proud, dignified. Look at the lighting. Which one of them is standing in the light?
Which one is
Lee is surrounded by sort of an angelic glow. He's standing, he's pristine, his uniform is put together, he's pressed and ironed. How about Grant? How does he look? So what is this painting actually?
from the South?
You think so? You think this is Southern propaganda? Yeah, it is absolutely Southern propaganda. It's part of what we call, okay, we had the myth of the North, and the myth of the North was that the Southern states were being held hostage by forces that had rebelled and needed to be liberated from those forces. That was the myth of the North. The myth of the South was that the South was all aristocratic, dignified, heroic men fighting for their freedom and their rights against a tyrannical Northern government. Okay, that's the myth of the South. So this is a picture that captures, after the fact, the surrender of Lee, couched in that myth of the South, that this noble prince of men that Robert E. Lee was, has dignified Grant with a surrender in the interests of preserving what was left of the South before this, wrinkled, disrespectful, short person could strip them of any more.
He was 15 years older than Grant.
Mm-hmm.
I thought they were close to the same age.
No. And Lee was pretty old, but no, Grant was pretty old too. Here is some of the propaganda from the North.
Is that Lincoln?
No, actually. This is Jefferson Davis. Now what happened was Jefferson Davis hid inside of a barn during the battle because, Richmond was burned. Richmond was the capital, and Jefferson Davis and his whole staff had to hide as the troops fought in Richmond. He was taken for his protection into a building, and then he was given a cloak and smuggled out. The cloak belonged to his wife. So word got out that he had dressed in his wife's clothing and fled for his life. What he actually did was put on his wife's cloak, but This is how that got translated in northern newspapers. Jefferson Davis fled from the advance of the Union in a dress, the president in petticoats, the last ditch of the chivalry. If this is the chivalry, if this is the world of chivalry and grace and beauty and, you know, knightliness that the South was, the antebellum with their, you know, white, you know, ladies that were held on pillars and their men presiding over a great knightly realm. If that's what they had, then this is the last ditch of that. Their president running away in a skirt. Okay, so pretty bitter, I would say pretty bitter that the rhetoric around the surrender was not what you would call friendly. Now, I will say that if you remember, I talked a little bit about the Battle of Gettysburg and that there was this one like philosophy professor who led a really great charge. He marched, that was Joshua Chamberlain, he marched his troops out, forced them to put on their best dress uniforms and marched them out and did an honor salute for Lee's men as they went by. You know, he put on a full parade of his men, and he was the one who actually took the surrender. So he took the sword from Lee, and he did it with all honors, as much honor as he could possibly muster among his men. So there was some of that, you know, pageantry on purpose to honor the sacrifice that these guys had actually made to try to repair as much as possible. But both of those things were basically fictional. I mean, it wasn't the noble knighthood that surrendered to the rapscallion, you know, peasant army. That's not what happened here. It was two forces that were facing off over completely different ideologies. Word didn't make it to everywhere all at once. This is, let's see, Lee surrendered in April, I think, of 1865. In May of 1865 in Texas, there was a Union, he wasn't a general, he was a colonel, a Union Colonel, John J. Williams. Or no, you know what, I've got his name here and it's not important. The important part is that there was a Union Colonel who heard that Lee had surrendered and heard that Union forces were withdrawing and that Confederate forces were withdrawing and that negotiations were being made. And he was sad because he had not yet managed to be in a battle. So he attacked, okay, in Texas, a Union officer attacked Confederate forces for unknown reasons. And basically looking at his journals, it was because he was waiting for his chance to be in the war and had actually never gotten one. He was very quickly overcome. And so after Lee surrendered at Appomattox, there was one more battle in Texas that was a Confederate victory. And that was the Battle of Palmetto Ranch. And the last person to be killed was this soldier, John J. Williams. The last soldier to die in the American Civil War was a Union soldier who was in a battle for no particular reason, because the Union officer had attacked because he thought, well, this is my last chance and I should take control of this Confederate battlefield while I still can, and then he lost. So Texas, woot. Anyway, the last word of the battle that came through, the last word of the war, finally reached the very, very southern tip of Texas, which is about as far out as you can get for Civil War battles. Even though there were small skirmishes in California, the farthest reaches of the Union forces actually marching in like ordered, assigned order actually happened in Texas. They marched into Texas and made sure to take control of several of these on June 19th, 1865, just to make sure there was no confusion. General Gordon Granger issued Special Order, General Order Number 3, which you have on your blackboard as a document to study. The people are informed that in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, that's the President, in accordance with the proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. Because there were whole pockets of Confederate Texas that had said, we don't care if Lee surrenders, we're keeping our slaves. We'll fight here. We'll just establish ourselves as a stronghold here. We'll fight here. So they had to march Union forces all the way into all this borderlander, messy areas of Texas where Rangers were still fighting and people were still like, we'll hold out to the last man. They had to march Union forces all the way in, and then they had to put this order in print. All slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. Freedmen are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. There is an account by Joshua Chamberlain, actually, of what happened when the Union forces took Lee's surrender, and that is that there were populations of slaves that began rioting, like right away, immediately, and that Union soldiers were forced to put down riots, looting riots mostly, of slaves of their plantations, and that was something that Union soldiers were like not very happy about. They had come down here, they had won against everything, and now they were being forced to capture, imprison, sometimes kill freedmen who were now rioting against their former masters. And the Union Army's job at this point was to impose order. But this day went down in history as the day that all the slaves were free. Once and for all, in America, no more slavery. June 19th, 1865, which is where Juneteenth comes from. Now, this is a holiday that is celebrated in Texas, and until I moved to Texas, I had never heard of it.
Really? They don't celebrate anywhere else?
It was celebrated in Texas. It's a holiday in Texas. Now, it spread out from Texas to through certain populations because Texas, African American people living in Texas moved out of Texas and moved into the north and moved into cities over the next 50 years, and they took this celebration with them when they did. But a year later was the first Juneteenth celebration. June 19th, 1866 was the first Juneteenth celebration, and it became an annual celebration. And it filtered out into the country, but there are still whole parts of the country that had never heard of it until last year. Go ahead.
What is it? I actually haven't heard of it, and I've been in Texas my whole life.
You want to?
We used to have block parties.
No.
I've heard of it, but I've never seen it in action.
Yeah, and it's a fairly specific holiday. It's a holiday to celebrate the slaves being set free. So it's largely celebrated in African American families. It's largely celebrated in Black communities, and it is most concentrated in Black communities in Texas. There are whole Black communities in Texas where they don't ever miss a Juneteenth celebration, and it's a huge deal. Right, they have whole block parties. They have huge churches have big events. African American churches have big events on Juneteenth, and it's a big deal. But because it happened in Texas is where it got its start, it only filtered out from those communities into the rest of the country slowly over time as people from Texas moved out into the rest of the country. So it wasn't declared across the board for all slaves, all former slaves in the entire United States that this was your day of freedom. It was a Texas holiday. But over the course of the last couple of years, Juneteenth has become something that people have become more educated about. It's become more national recognition. So for a lot of people, last year was the first time they'd ever heard of Juneteenth because they had record Juneteenth celebrations last year because of the record Black Lives Movement protests that happened last year. So it was a sort of a response to that. It was sort of a way to put a positive message into what was an extremely negative national, movement, that protests that were happening because of racial inequalities and police interactions and stuff like that. This was a way for the country to have a positive spin on that, was for the whole country to suddenly become educated about Juneteenth. But it had started in Texas, and it has always been kind of a big deal in certain places in Texas. And in other places, people had never heard of it. So this was essentially the end of the Civil War. 618,000 Americans died in the Civil War, and that's on both sides. At that time, the nation's population was 31 million. That means that 2% of the population died in the Civil War. 2%, which doesn't sound like a lot until you recognize that only a tenth of that died in World War II. Okay, and it's not the number. In the Second World War, 318,000 Americans died when the population was 131 million. So a much smaller percentage of the population died. It wasn't just that 300,000 less people died Americans died in World War II than died in the Civil War. It was that percentage of the population was much smaller by then. 300 million people. If the United States sustained losses at the same level as during the Civil War, if we fought another war and lost 2% of our country, that would mean 6 million Americans would have to die. Okay, at the current level of the population. And they didn't die by the thousands. They died one at a time. Every single one of them had a family. Every single one was an individual. So we can't really cast it as numbers exactly. As a result, this is a moment that defines American history. It is the moment that all of the fractures pointed towards. All of the initial little breaks in the tree as it formed together turned into these great big fractures. That's why you do that fracture project. And we are still recovering from some of the things that happened in the Civil War. We're still recovering from some of the animosities, and a lot of those fractures are still there between the North and the South. So this is a huge moment. The end of the Civil War is a huge moment in American history just because of the losses that have been stacked.